Hour with Chris Barr.
ABC Radio Sydney, Canberra and New South Wales.
Tonight in Who Was Wednesday, the evening's chat where we delve into history to find out more about some of its more colourful characters. It is back to looking at Australia's early leaders this evening. Can you imagine working in a coal mine in the mid-1800s at the age of around 10? You'd think maybe, if you were, about the last thing you'd be expecting to be was Australia's Prime Minister. But that is what happened to one of our earliest leaders. He wasn't just Prime Minister once, he was Prime Minister 3 times. Tonight, a look at the life of Andrew Fisher with David Headon, Foundation Fellow of the Australian Studies Institute at ANU and Associate at the Parliamentary Library. David, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Chris.
Okay, so Andrew Fisher, where was he born?
He was born in Scotland at I guess, about an hour's drive, and I was there last year, about an hour's drive out of Glasgow. We've got a bit of an idea of what Glasgow was not that long back, and indeed sort of in the past couple of hundred years from Jimmy Barnes in over the last 10 years or so. And it's pretty rugged still, it must be said, and the village of Crosshouse, where Fisher was born, is only a very small village to this day, and it's not particularly pleasant, albeit that they've held on, and that's wonderful that they have, to their Andrew Fisher story. So he was there for the first 23 years of his life. His father, his grandfather had been coal miners, in some ways radicalised coal miners, as was Fisher. And he had, I guess you'd have to say finally, the good sense to migrate with his brother when he was 23 and he migrated to Queensland. I imagine that would have been, at least in terms of the weather, a very radical shift.
Queensland, near Glasgow. Yeah, definitely. So he had fairly poor beginnings by the sounds of things.
He certainly did, but a really wonderful, loving family. He was one of 8 kids, and they were all devoted to their parents. His father was a rock. He was a man who was very much involved in the establishing of the cooperative societies in Scotland. They didn't want per se for food. They were never starving, but it was tough in the mines. Ayrshire mines weren't so bad. That was the where he was, and they were okay by the standards of coal mines in the rest of Scotland, but they were none too flash. You know, you had quite literally leather collars around the necks of a number of the miners indicating whose company they were working for. So it wasn't good. He was a pit boy, as you say. We don't know for certain that he was 10. He might have been 9. His wife-to-be, Margaret, suggested that in later years. So that young, he was in the mines. You weren't supposed to start in the mines until you were 12, according to legislation, but that was ignored. So he was in the mines and had very little education, only about 5 years in a small little school in Crosshouse, and then he was able to get to do some courses at night after being in the mines in the years of his later teens. And he, like his father and grandfather, got radicalised, but in his case it went to the point of being blacklisted on 2 or 3 occasions. Whereupon he learnt to drive a train. He was an engine driver for a short period of time, like Ben Chifley in the decades ahead. But ultimately, it was felt by the family, and they had a family sort of, conference, gathering, meeting around the kitchen table to decide whether 1 or 2 of the boys should migrate to Australia, and it was decided, to see what it was like out there. So they headed off when Fisher was 23 years of age.
So what was his progression into politics when he arrived in Queensland? Presumably he didn't sort of dive straight in.
No. Absolutely not. In the first instance, of course, it was to find a position in the mines, in some of the mines of Queensland. But these mines were not shaped to give a good deal to the workers. So it wasn't easy. He was going from coal mine to coal mine. And finally in 1887, so that's a couple of years after he arrived in Queensland with his brother in 1885, he started work in a gold mine in Gympie. and Gympie would become his home, the family home, all the way through to when he finally moved to Melbourne as a federal politician in 1906. But through that period, Gympie was home, and he loved the place. We can see a rebuild of his cottage in Gympie today, and that's definitely, for listeners out there interested, definitely worth a visit to Gympie to see the Fisher connections. They are there. But in his case, he was keen to get involved once again in politics, notwithstanding the Scottish experience, and he did. And the result of that was that he was finally elected in 1893. From 1893 to 1896, he was in the Queensland Colonial Parliament. He was very much at the pointy end of advocating social welfare legislation ahead of most of his fellows. And he just missed in the election of 1896, out of politics for 3 years, and then finally came back in 1899, Chris. And boy, is that a story, because when he came back, shortly after that, the first Labor government jurisdiction in the world, it only lasted for 6 days in 1899, but for that short period of time, Fisher was a minister in the government of Anderson Dawson, and it was history making in that sense. So he's in that government in 1899 for 6 days. He is then elected for the seat of Wide Bay in 1901 into the Commonwealth Parliament. So, of course, going to Melbourne for those gatherings. And then, again, in a series of firsts of this extraordinary individual, he was a member of the first national Labor government, in this case of a Prime Minister that we'll discuss in the coming weeks, Chris Watson. And that was in 1904 for not very long at all, a minister once again. And then finally, he was the second Labor Prime Minister when he was elected in 1908. He, like Deakin, was the Prime Minister no less than 3 times, and their lives are parallels in certain ways, but not least that the second Prime Ministership of both Alfred Deakin, who we discussed recently, and of Andrew Fisher, were the major contributions to the political structure of this country. You know, we talked with Deakin, you'll remember, about the compact that Deakin established, an egalitarian compact based on decent social welfare legislation. Well, Deakin put that together from 1905 to 1908, and Fisher, in his second prime ministership, 1910 to 1913, added to it in a range of really important ways for the Australian nation of the future.
So what are some of the things that he did in his second term as Prime Minister?
To begin with, and you think these days, and it's hard to get legislation through, would you believe that his government managed 110 acts?
That's extraordinary.
Absolutely incredible. It was, if we can say, and to give Deakin absolute credit here, along with Fisher, that this was the period, Chris, between, say, 1905 and 1913, when the rest of the world was coming to Australia to learn about our political system and, above all, about our progressive social welfare legislation. We were the social lab of the world, and Fisher added to that. What are the sorts of things that his government did in the second period? Well, they established the first Australian currency, that it would become the only legal tender. They established the Commonwealth Bank to be a people's bank, a lot different to the Commonwealth Bank of today. They strengthened the already world-leading Conciliation and Arbitration Act. They introduced land tax, progressive land tax on unimproved property, built around the American figure of the later 19th century, Henry George, a book that he wrote called Progress and Poverty. And that was basically, that's how you get at the rich in society. Fisher was a believer there. They did the first part of the construction of the Trans-Australian Railway from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie. There was the establishment, the commissioning of the first 3 ships of the Royal Australian Navy. They improved the invalid and age pensions. They introduced maternity allowances for the first time, workers' compensation for the first time, and a story close to my heart. Fisher was the one, his government, his second government, to make sure that the national capital would be in Canberra. So the foundation stones and naming ceremonies of the 12th of March 1913 were very much because of not only Andrew Fisher as Prime Minister, but his Minister for Home Affairs, the larger-than-life King O'Malley. And then I guess you'd finally say, Chris, that the best-known speech was his last man, last shilling speech. In other words, Australians would be involved with Britain in the Great War to the last man and the last shilling. Interestingly, if you read the detail of that speech, this was coming from a man who had been pretty much a full-blown pacifist in the past and would be utterly emotionally undone by the experience of the Great War.
What did it do to him?
He was devastated by it on a range of fronts that really is almost the sort of, the topic or topics for another program. He went into that war as the Prime Minister third time round, but he was never convinced by it, other than the fact, if you like, that Germany was the aggressor, therefore a victory over the aggressor Germany was needed. But with his pacifist background, and he completely opposed the Boer War, around about the time of Federation, 1899, 1900, 1901, he was entirely against the Boer War, so that when he was thrust, I guess with the grimmest of ironies, into the position of doing this in late 1914, he was very wary. And that was reinforced in spades when Gallipoli, when the Gallipoli landing occurred. He was not convinced at all by it. He believed, as Prime Minister, that he had not been in any way consulted, nor had he been, by the imperial hierarchy. That he was determined to have a say. It was virtually impossible in his third Prime Ministership. And because he was so undone by the terrible loss of life at Gallipoli, he decided that he no longer wanted to be Prime Minister and thus became the second Australian High Commissioner to London after George Reid.
So he resigned as Prime Minister, didn't he?
He did. He did. He did resign, and he was always a believer in the earlier years, if you were the government, that you would determine who would be in these primary representative positions, including, that plum position in London. So he felt that he was the person to do that job. When he went there, he was involved with the Dardanelles Commission, a member of that commission. He was appalled by the decision-making that led to the Australian troops going to Gallipoli. And interestingly, two things happened during the Great War years, amongst others. One was that, like Deakin, and Deakin was struggling desperately with dementia through these years, as we've discussed, but Fisher had the onset of a form of dementia himself during the war years. So he didn't die until 1928, but he was experiencing dementia, certainly from the late teens, in a significant way.
He's often described as the Prime Minister who disappeared, who just disappeared. Is that fair? Is it a fair description of him?
No, it's not. Not in the slightest. It's because we've talked a bit in the program about the scholarship around Deakin, and especially the scholarship around Reid, where his reputation suffered. Fisher suffered in the same way. This is a man, a Federation father about whom today we like most of them, we know very little. And that's worse than unfortunate, because and he wasn't as charismatic as either Deakin or Reid or Hughes, and he wasn't as good a speaker, but he was perhaps as important, if not more important than all of them in terms of his prime ministerships, especially the second one. But he suffered too because Labor, other than the Scullin years, 1929 and 1931, under pressure of the Great Depression, Labor was not in power in between the wars. And thus, that first generation of post-Great War historians, conservatives to a person, not Labor men at all, like A.J. Jose and Ernest Scott, they were convinced that there was nothing particularly striking about Fisher. And then you got the second wave of conservative historians in the 1960s, and they regarded Fisher as mediocre, as a slow thinker. He was neither of those, not even close. What he was a diligent worker. I'm tempted to make the connection to the coal mining background, but he knew that it was important to get things done. You didn't go out there with fanfare, and that's exactly what his governments did. But then he got the unkindest cut of all. He had the experience of the Great War. Once the Great War started, we were involved in the Empire story and a catastrophic loss of life. And because Fisher was not a part of that, his reputation suffered in the decades that followed.
David Headon is here, and we're chatting about Andrew Fisher, one of our earlier Prime Ministers in Who Was Wednesday. Was he a popular Prime Minister at the time?
He was very popular. I am pleased to say there were so many aspects of Fisher that people did like. When he was elected his second government, it was also another first for Fisher because it was the first government post-Federation where the governing party had a majority in both houses. So that's why, Chris, he was able to, in fact, attack legislation and produce 110 acts. But they were extremely popular. They were putting more flesh on the bones that Deakin had basically created from 1905 to 1908. And they were no-brainers. They were simply no-brainers for the Australian population. So really popular. When he lost the election of the second government in 1913, he missed by one seat for reasons that we won't go into, but by one seat so that Cook takes over, the so-called first Labor rat. He had been a Labor man himself, a coal miner in Britain as a youngster. Cook took over, but it wasn't long until the Fisher government was re-established after a double dissolution election in 1914. So extremely popular in lots of ways, not just because of the political achievements, but he was a very important cultural figure. He had a strong sense of putting flesh again around the bones of the national project. So
he was a federationist, wasn't he?
Oh, totally. A strong believer, as some in the Labor movement in the 1890s going up to 1901 were not. That was, that sort of split the Labor movement. He was a strong federationist. He named the wattle as the national flower. He looked at the coat of arms, which was pretty grim, and completely re-established it as the coat of arms we know today, with the state emblems on the shield, with the seven-pointed, and the Federation Star and the Southern Cross. So that was remodelled. He was very much behind the first artist studio in Melbourne, where people like Tom Roberts and Streeton were involved, Conda, Meldrum, Longstaff. He was a Republican in principle, who was appalled by the frills and what he called the frills and the fopperies of dress, so that when he did reluctantly agree to becoming a Privy Councillor in 1911, he absolutely rejected more than once to be knighted, and he actually refused, as a result of the war experience, the very prestigious French Legion of Honour. He bought the Petherick collection, which is the great first collection of the National Library. He had a really profound sense of the national sensibility, or if you like, contributing to the national sensibility as part of the nation-building project.
It's quite extraordinary for a man who had so little early education in his life, who basically came out of the pits to emigrate.
Quite literally in this case. I mean. Yeah. Precisely. So it's a really lovely quote. It's very short. When he gave a speech on Capitol Hill on the 12th of March 1913 to start the building of Canberra, there was a wonderful speech given by Lord Denman, the 5th Governor-General, a very interesting character himself, and an excellent speech. But Fisher was just about as good, and in one piece, it goes to the very question you just asked, Fisher said, and I quote directly, "Here on this spot in the near future, and I hope the distant future too, the best thoughts of Australia will be given expression to. I hope this city will be the seat of learning as well as of politics, and it will also be the home of art."
Well, we'll have to explore, I think, the formation of Canberra on another night, because the fact that the 12th of March is still Canberra Day today, I think we need to delve into that at some point, David, if you're up for it.
Love to do so. Yeah, absolutely up for it.
You mentioned Lord Denman there, who was Governor-General at one point, I know, when Andrew Fisher was Prime Minister. And if Andrew Fisher had so much opposition to what the British High Command was doing in World War I and was quite miffed that he wasn't at all consulted by, notionally his imperial masters in Britain, how well did he get on with the Governor-General? Because Lord Denman was a very interesting character.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And he got on extremely well. It's interesting. Fisher, was in 1911 in Britain for the coronation of George V. George Reid was the Australian High Commissioner then. Reid held a dinner where Fisher and George Pearce, a very important minister in the Labor government at that stage and in terms of defence, etc., they got to not only meet Denman, but got to know the Denmans well at that point. In fact, Lady Denman said when she was in Australia that she preferred the Labor men to the non-Labor men that she was meeting.
Well, Andrew Fisher was quite dashing if you look at his photographs, so you can kind of understand why.
I've got to agree. This was a very suave-looking chap. Interestingly, pretty dour and stolid in a sort of a Scottish Australian way. But that was something that many people responded positively to, not least the Denmans. So that the Denmans were very comfortable in all the activities that they had to do with the Labor government. It was mostly a Fisher Labor government when they were in Australia. So they got on extremely well, and even to the extent that George Pearce, perhaps we can talk about him at a later date, who was concerned about the German-Austrian build-up in Europe and concerned that Australia should do its bit, as Fisher finally was worried by the same set of circumstances, they worked closely together on that in Australia. And ultimately, when the Denmans went back to Britain just before the outbreak of the Great War. So they got in, really well. And it's interesting, when Chris, he was when he was awarded to become a Privy Councillor, there was, you'd imagine, a flash ceremony in London. What did Fisher do? He didn't attend the ceremony. He went back to his town of Crosshouse where they were having a small gig, not for him, but something that he thought was important. So that's where he was when he was supposed to be getting the award of being a Privy Councillor.
What was his personal life like? Because didn't he marry his landlady's daughter when he was in a boarding house in Queensland?
Oh, you're entirely across it. In Gympie, absolutely true. And she was a formidable woman. There are a few stories that you get from the children. It would appear to be the case that the Fisher children never saw their parents kiss. Notwithstanding, they had a relationship of great affection and mutual understanding and support. To give one excellent example for the listening audience in 2019, when they were in London in 1911 for the coronation, that was the summer of the Great Suffragette March. Where that wonderful tapestry in the Parliament today in Canberra, Trust the Women, that was embroidered, where that was created. Vida Goldstein and other Australian suffragist feminists were there. They knew only too well that the South Australian women had got the vote in 1894, and the Australian women had the vote as a result of the Constitution post-1901. They were there to support. Well, so was Margaret Fisher. There's a wonderful photograph of Vida Goldstein and Margaret Fisher and others at that march. And in Andrew's case, yes, Australian women had the vote, but they weren't considered as such as political candidates. It's probable that Vida Goldstein would have been a senator had she joined the Labor Party, but she was horrified by the prospect of party politics. So she never did. She ran as an independent, I think lost 4 or 5 elections.
She was a woman before her time, David.
She was totally ahead of her time. And in Andrew Fisher's case, he went on the record as saying that what the Labor Party had to do was to get women to be on the ticket, at the top of the ticket to become a senator. Had they done so, they would have in fact been voted in much earlier than the first Australian women in the Parliament, which was not until 1943.
How many kids did Margaret and Andrew Fisher have?
They produced a daughter who never married. She was the last to die in 1988, and she went back to Crosshouse in 1978. She was Peggy. There were 5 sons, 6 kids. Given he's a pit boy as a youngster, Andrew Fisher, one son went to Oxford, distinguished career. One son went to Cambridge, distinguished career. One son went to the University of London, distinguished career. Peggy, in her own right, had a distinctive contribution to Australian culture, and the other 2 were very significant Australian journalists. But sadly, given the impact of the war, there was a terrible impact on the family, and in particular on mother and father. In August 1916, Margaret gave birth to a stillborn baby who was buried at Hampstead Cemetery, which is where Fisher's obelisk is today.
It does sound like that First World War had a dreadful impact on his life. Did he recover well from the birth of their stillborn baby, or did that just add to his sadness?
It's suggested that with both of them they didn't really recover. He was a man destroyed by the Great War and the experience of the Great War, and that must have been a terrible part of it, because he felt the death that was happening around him, and especially of Australians coming all that distance. This was a man profoundly affected by it, and I don't, by no means was the beginnings of dementia a part of that, but that certainly didn't help his experience post the war, and it was made the worse by the conscription referenda brought on by Billy Hughes that split the Australian community. So Hughes had the run of things as soon as he became the Labor Party Prime Minister and then Prime Minister in his own right after election through these years. And he was effectively a warmonger, so that when he had a run at the first conscription referendum to get conscription of Australians to the overseas war, he tried to get all these significant people to publicly indicate they were signing to support the referendum. Each of the previous Prime Ministers and the present Prime Minister Hughes signed that, including a former Labor man Cook and including a former Labor Prime Minister Watson. Fisher refused. Not only did he refuse, but when he arrived in Paris first and then London to become the second Australian High Commissioner, he was so appalled by what was going on that he broke ranks, much to the disgust of Hughes and a number of those believing in the Empire Project in Europe, because Fisher severely criticised what was happening, the nature of the leadership, the terrible loss of life. He was by no means popular, not only in the later part of that war, but after the war as well. And he was utterly marginalised by Hughes, whose main connection for information and the propagation of information was, would you believe, one Keith Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's father.
See, this is why I'm starting to understand why he decided to retire in London, because I couldn't understand why a bloke who was so angry, it seems to be, at the notion of empire and the noose that effectively the British Empire had around Australia's neck at the time would then come back to Australia after being the High Commissioner, but not retire here. So did he not retire in Australia and he chose to retire and die eventually in London because of that marginalisation? Was that the problem?
I mean, he was having been undone by the horror of the Great War years, and with the beginnings, the onset, if you like, of dementia, and arguably above all, what had happened to his Australian community, for which he had worked so hard and held out such hopes of being a world leader, a progressive thinker with social welfare legislation, that had been crushed by the onset of the war and then by the activities and the Prime Ministership of Billy Hughes. He knew the community was divided, and that too appalled him. And he was also aware that a number of the people who had been closest to him in his governments, and the best example is George Pearce, would become pro-conscriptionists in the national government of Billy Hughes. He stayed in touch with Pearce, and Pearce continued to be an admirer of this extraordinary individual and his principle and his integrity. But for Fisher, that was a devastating set of consequences of Australia's involvement in the Great War.
Yeah, it sounds like his heart was broken.
The look on his face in photographs post the Great War, starting with one taken on Armistice Day, then there's something missing. You know, he was said to have, the children said, a wonderful sense of humour and a great warmth. Dare I say it, in those later photographs, these are elements of his character that he seemed to have lost.
So where does he sit for you, David, in the pantheon of Australian prime ministers?
Right at the top level, the top tier. There is no doubt that the set of legislation that his second government, but actually all three of his governments, but let's focus on the major one over 3 years and 2 months, the legislation that he put together there went definitely not only beyond Deakin's work in his 3 years in his second prime ministership, but really broadened it for a much greater understanding of what those pieces of legislation could create for Australia. For Fisher, who'd had so little education, it was all about wanting the best for the community, which included the best kinds of education for the Australian population. And that's what he went about doing. That not just contributed, but in lots of ways built the first fabric of Australians' understanding of themselves as a nation. So once you consider that, and you consider the contribution of the man in the most difficult years, the Great War years, a man who was willing to interrogate the decision-making of the Empire Project, then this puts him in the top rank of Australian Prime Ministers.
Well, David, it's been wonderful hearing more about Prime Minister Andrew Fisher. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to chatting to you again soon about Canberra Day, and I reckon we might check out Lord and Lady Denman too.
Definitely have a look. I'll send you some stuff up, Chris. But they're a great read, along with Fisher's contribution and the wonderful King O'Malley. I can hardly wait.
Thanks, David. David Headon there. He's Foundation Fellow at the Australian Studies Institute at ANU and Associate at the Parliamentary Library. And I know this is a way off, but you might want to put it in your diary. On October 22, David is going to be in London giving a lecture on Andrew Fisher at the Australian High Commission. And he's also going to be speaking at the Scottish Parliament. So if you just happen to be in London on October 22, pop it in your diary. Serving the original Ruben F. scarf and also the son of Richie Benno. That's good, Anne. Andy from Mogo says, I served Elliot Gould at Manly Post Office in the early 90s. And this one from Sam, my lame claim to fame was for a year in year 5 being taught guitar by Bruce Throburn of the Hooly Doolies. Didn't pursue it after the year and can't remember any guitar now. But hey, he was taught by a Hooly Dooly.